How can one storm, two wild kittens, and an unexpected act of kindness unite a whole town? When Ellen Parker found Rebel and Peanut by the roadside, she never imagined the rescue would ripple through her quiet Colorado community, changing neighbors, rules, and even her own heart. Love animal stories like this? Hit like and subscribe to join our journey of compassion and wild wonder. The storm was one of those Colorado tempests that seemed to roll in out of nowhere, rattling the foothills with thunder and hurling rain so hard it blurred the windshield into a shimmer of gray. Ellen Parker gripped the steering wheel tighter, peering through the streaks of water as her old Subaru crawled along the narrow road. It was late and she shouldn't have been driving, but the landslide had blocked her usual route, forcing her to take this winding, unfamiliar path home. Every muscle in her 61-year-old body ached, her knuckles white against the faded leather steering wheel. For Ellen, cats had always been trouble. In her childhood, stray toms clawed through her family's garbage and kept her up at night. In adulthood, her late husband's barn cats left fur and broken things in their wake. Even in her years as an ER nurse, she'd never cared for the feline patients. Too wild, too unpredictable, too indifferent to affection. She preferred order, and she'd built her life, especially since Tom's passing, around a careful, precise solitude. A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the twisted silhouette of pines. She slowed at a stretch where water gushed across the road, making the tires hiss. That was when she saw them, two small, sodden shapes crouched in the yellow sweep of her headlights, not more than 20 feet ahead. Her foot slammed the brake. The car shuddered, fishtailed slightly, and stopped just short of the huddled forms. Her heart thudded. "No, no, no," she muttered, more out of habit than hope. Rain pelted the roof. Through the glare, she could see tiny ears and thin legs shaking with every rumble of thunder. Bobcat kittens, she realized, impossibly young and completely alone. She had never seen one so close, small, spindly, all enormous eyes and wet fur clinging to their bony frames. Behind her, something moved in the shadows. Ellen squinted through the side mirror. A coyote, mangy, ribs visible even through the rain, crept down the slope, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Instinct flickered inside her, the old nurse's reflex, faster than thought. She slammed the car into park, yanked her coat tighter, and bolted into the downpour. The rain slapped her skin, freezing cold. Her shoes squelched in the mud as she ran, waving her arms at the coyote. "Get out of here!" she shouted. The animal paused, eyes glinting, then melted back into the trees. The kittens shrank away from her, mewling softly, too exhausted to run. Ellen's old hospital flannel was in the back seat, a leftover from her years on night shift, threadbare but warm. She scooped it up, then crouched beside the trembling kittens. For a moment she hesitated, rain pouring down her face, her body tense to retreat from these wild, dangerous creatures. But they were so small, shivering with fear and cold, and she saw something in them, some raw vulnerability that called to the part of her that used to comfort frightened children and broken parents in the ER. "Okay," she whispered, "just for tonight." She wrapped them up together, careful not to touch their faces. The kittens didn't resist. They barely moved at all, only their wide eyes flicking from her to the dark woods. As she hurried them back to the car, the storm ramped up, wind howling, trees swaying like dancers in a nightmare. Ellen slammed the door and cranked the heat, peeling off her dripping coat. The kittens huddled on the passenger seat, still as stones, their fur streaked with mud and rain, too weak even to cry. She glanced at the clock, past midnight. Home was still 20 minutes away, and every instinct screamed at her to call animal control, to hand these wild things over to someone who knew what to do. But she hesitated, fingers trembling on her phone. The old familiar fear rose up, of not doing enough, of failing, of holding death in her hands and being helpless to stop it. Images flickered through her mind. The son she'd lost years ago, the patients she'd watched slip away, the loneliness that had become her companion since Tom died. A sudden movement from the smaller kitten, a weak, pitiful cry, made her chest tighten. She found herself talking to them, her voice shaking. "You picked the wrong car, little guys. I don't even like cats." But her hands, trained by decades in the ER, were already moving with careful efficiency, tucking the flannel tighter, checking for wounds. The kittens' hearts fluttered under her fingers, their breathing shallow. As she drove the rest of the way home, Ellen caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wide with something that felt like terror and hope twisted together. She saw herself as she was now, solitary, battered by life's storms, always bracing for the next blow. And for the first time in years, she saw a flicker of something else, purpose maybe, or just the stubborn, battered spark that had kept her going this long. When she pulled into her driveway, the rain had turned to a steady, miserable drizzle. She gathered the kittens, bundled tight in the flannel, and hurried inside, heart hammering. She didn't bother turning on the lights. In the darkness, the house felt less empty, less haunted by memories. She set the kittens down on the kitchen table, listening to their ragged breathing, watching the rise and fall of their tiny chests. Ellen Parker, who'd spent most of her life running from cats and grief alike, now found herself at a crossroads she hadn't chosen. The storm still raged outside, but something in her had shifted. She wouldn't call animal control, not tonight. Instead, she reached for her old first aid kit, her mind racing with everything she'd ever learned about hypothermia and shock. She would try to save them, just this once. Outside, the wind howled and the trees bowed low, but inside, a new story had already begun. One born of loneliness, wildness, and the desperate hope that rescue, in any form, was still possible. The storm didn't let up. Wind rattled the windows of Ellen's kitchen as she snapped on the light, bringing the old farmhouse's heart to life. The space smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant. Her world for the last 15 years since Tom passed, filled with quiet and shadow and the steady tick of the clock above the stove. Tonight, though, that routine had been shattered. She was no longer alone. The two Bobcat kittens huddled on the flannel on her kitchen table, eyes squeezed shut against the glare. Their fur was soaked through, spiked and muddy, bodies limp as if the effort to survive had used up every ounce of strength. Ellen's hands hovered uncertain as she reached for the thermometer and towels. Old instincts warred with new fear. "Come on, Parker," she muttered. "You've done worse in the ER on a double shift." But this was different. These weren't patients with charts or families waiting in the hall. These were wild things, their fates tangled with hers for reasons she couldn't explain. The smaller one, whom she later named Peanut, shivered violently, every breath a faint whistle. The larger, Rebel, was only slightly better off, alert, wary, eyes flicking to every shadow. Ellen's training kicked in. She dried them as gently as she could, the towel swallowing up their mewling bodies, her hands working almost on their own. She filled a hot water bottle, wrapped it in another towel, and set it near them, careful not to burn their delicate skin. Next came the real challenge: food. Ellen rummaged through her pantry, cursing softly at her lack of anything suitable. Cats. She'd never had a reason to keep kitten formula on hand. She ended up warming some diluted goat's milk in the microwave, then found an old medicine syringe in her first aid drawer. As she drew up the warm milk, her hands shook. An old echo of fear from nights in the ER when a child's life hung on the smallest action. She picked up Rebel first. The kitten hissed, weak but defiant, squirming in her grip. Ellen held firm but gentle, nudging the syringe to its mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. The kitten's eyes, blue and enormous, stared up at her. Then slowly, it latched on, slurping at the milk with desperate energy. Ellen felt her chest loosen, a small bubble of relief breaking through the storm. Peanut was another story. The little one barely moved, only the flutter of its ribs betraying life. Ellen cradled it in her palm, fingers trembling. She flashed back unbidden to a hospital room years ago, a tiny child, smaller than this kitten, fighting for breath as machines beeped and alarms blared. She remembered the helplessness, the way hope felt like a betrayal when the odds were so thin. "Not tonight," she whispered, voice raw. "Not again." She tried everything, stroking Peanut's throat, massaging its sides, coaxing a few drops of milk into its mouth. Nothing. Minutes passed. The wind outside battered the house as if it might tear it apart. Rebel mewled from the flannel nest, a plaintive, worried sound. Ellen felt panic clawing at her chest. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the rhythm of her hands, the small, vital signs of life. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured, the endearment surprising her. She pressed the kitten against the warm water bottle, massaged its tiny back, then tried the syringe again. 1 drop, 2, 3. For a moment, Peanut gagged and Ellen's heart plummeted. Then, a miracle. The kitten swallowed, feeble but real. Its eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. Ellen nearly wept with relief. She fed them in turns, working until her arms ached and her mind spun. Outside, thunder grumbled over the mountains. Inside, the world shrank to the circle of lamplight, 2 fragile lives, and the frantic, determined beat of Ellen's heart. Her kitchen became an emergency ward, countertops lined with towels, bowls of water, makeshift heating pads. Hours slipped by. Rebel grew stronger with each feeding, pushing at the sides of the towel, headbutting Ellen's fingers. Peanut was slower, each breath an effort, but the stubbornness in its eyes reminded Ellen of herself. Too many battles fought and lost, but still unwilling to give in. At one point, as the storm quieted outside, Ellen sat back on her heels, exhaustion settling into her bones. Her thoughts wandered, unbidden, to the loss that haunted her deepest hours, the child she couldn't save, the marriage that faded into silence after Tom's heart attack, the friends who slipped away as she walled herself off. She'd survived all that, but each new wound left her a little more hollow. She'd built her life around safety, control, and solitude, never letting anything in that might break her again. Yet here she was, risking heartbreak for 2 wild animals she'd never wanted. Her phone vibrated on the counter, breaking her reverie. The number for animal control blinked on the screen, a silent reminder of the rules, the right thing to do. If she called, they'd come quickly, take the kittens away, maybe euthanize them. She pictured their tiny bodies, the struggle she'd seen tonight, the unclaimed wildness in their eyes. Something hardened inside her. She turned the phone face down. "No one's taking you tonight," she whispered. "We fight. That's what we do here." As dawn crept in, a faint gold ribbon on the horizon, Ellen finally exhaled. Both kittens lay nestled in the flannel, Rebel's paw draped protectively over Peanut. Their breathing had steadied. For the first time in years, Ellen felt hope, sharp, frightening, but real. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but tonight they had survived together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change everything. The storm faded into memory, leaving Ellen's world washed clean and strangely still. The days that followed blurred together, defined less by the calendar than by the soft, insistent demands of her 2 new charges. Her old farmhouse, nestled against a backdrop of pine woods and distant, mist-capped mountains, became a world unto itself, a cocoon of routines and quiet discoveries, far removed from the noise and expectations of the outside world. Ellen found herself waking before dawn, listening to the soft, wheezing purrs of Rebel and Peanut as they slept in their basket lined with faded hospital flannel. The mornings were slow, a gentle ritual of preparing syringes of warmed formula, checking the kittens' temperatures, and cleaning up the inevitable messes. Rebel, the larger of the 2, was already showing his spirit. He greeted each day with an insistent, almost bossy mew, demanding food and attention before Ellen could even get her coffee brewing. Peanut, in contrast, was all timidity and caution, shrinking back at loud noises and clinging to the familiar nest as though it was her only safe harbor in a confusing world. Some days, Ellen watched the fog roll in over the pines and wondered at the strangeness of it all. She'd spent a lifetime avoiding cats, never understood people who let their pets climb all over them, never felt that purring, furred companionship others spoke of. Now, these wild creatures needed her, utterly dependent, and something in her chest began to thaw, almost against her will. The outside world pressed in only occasionally, a neighbor's pickup on the distant road, the mail truck's brief stop at the end of the lane, a reminder that normal life went on elsewhere. Here, inside, Ellen's kitchen felt suspended in time. Sleep became a rare luxury. She found herself dozing in the recliner with one eye open, every sound from the basket triggering a nurse's reflex honed by decades of crisis. She learned the rhythms of bottle feeding, the gentle art of stimulating tiny bellies so they'd relieve themselves, the careful balance of warmth and hydration. Yet it wasn't all science and schedules. In the hush of the house, when both kittens finally slept, Ellen began to write again, journals filled with half-formed thoughts, old regrets, the ache of memories she tried to bury beneath layers of routine. She wrote about the kittens, about how Rebel's fierce independence reminded her of herself at 17, ready to take on the world with nothing but stubbornness and a quick tongue. She wrote about Peanut's fragility and how it made her think of her son Jamie, how he'd clung to her after the accident, how the hospital lights seemed to steal the color from his cheeks until nothing was left but longing and loss. There were nights when Ellen sat alone by the window, the house dim except for the soft glow of the lamp, and felt the old pain press in. She would watch Rebel and Peanut breathing in tandem, tiny chests rising and falling in the shared safety of the flannel nest. Sometimes the sight made her smile. Other times, it sent her spiraling back into memories she'd tried so hard to avoid. She wondered if healing was ever really possible, or if some wounds just scabbed over and waited to break open again. The advice from the wildlife hotline echoed in her mind. Don't get attached. Don't treat them like pets. Keep them wild. Ellen wanted to follow the rules, to do what was right. But how do you care for something, feed it, warm it, sing it to sleep, without letting it under your skin? She caught herself humming lullabies she hadn't sung since Jamie was small. She found herself talking to the kittens as she worked, telling them about her day, about the mountains, about the weather. In their presence, the house no longer felt so empty. Rebel, true to his name, was soon exploring beyond the basket, his tiny claws clacking on the linoleum as he made daring expeditions beneath the table and behind the stove. Ellen would pretend to scold him, but she was secretly proud of his courage. Peanut stayed close, but each day she ventured a little farther, sometimes following Rebel, sometimes seeking out Ellen's lap when the shadows seemed too big. There were setbacks, of course. One evening, Ellen came in from fetching firewood to find Peanut trembling violently, feverish and lethargic. A wave of dread swept over her. She worked through the night, cool compresses, hydration, whispered reassurances, haunted by old memories of hospital nights that ended in heartbreak. But as dawn broke, Peanut rallied, her tiny body stubbornly refusing to quit. The relief that flooded Ellen was so sharp it made her laugh out loud, shaky and wild, tears sliding down her face as the kittens blinked up at her in confusion. It was in these quiet, haunted nights that Ellen realized how much had changed. The walls she'd built, brick by careful brick since Jamie died, had started to crumble. The kittens needed her, yes, but she needed them too. Their presence was a balm she hadn't known she was searching for, an echo of the joy and pain of motherhood, of the desperate hope that even after loss, something new might take root. Days slipped into a gentle routine, Ellen's heart opening a little more with each small victory. The kitten's first playful tussle, the way Rebel would curl protectively around Peanut, the sight of sunlight glinting on their sleek fur as they slept in the kitchen window. She knew it couldn't last forever. She'd been warned after all. Wild things must return to the wild. But for now, in the hush of her mountain home, Ellen let herself feel needed again. And in that fragile peace, beneath the weight of old grief and the uncertain promise of tomorrow, she allowed herself to hope. The sun crested the ridge at dawn, casting gold across Ellen's porch. It was the kind of morning that felt like a fresh start. The air washed clean by the rain, pine needles glistening, mist rolling off the foothills and curling around her old house like a living thing. Ellen stood at the threshold, basket of kittens in her arms, and felt, for the first time in years, a sliver of anticipation for the day ahead. By now, Rebel and Peanut had woven themselves into her daily rhythm. They were bigger, stronger, wilder every morning, their spots bright against their new, glossy coats. Ellen had come to recognize the different timbres of their voices, Rebel's insistent mews, Peanut's plaintive trills, the soft purrs they shared when curled together for warmth. She knew their quirks too, how Rebel lunged for her shoelaces, how Peanut hid under the old blue chair whenever thunder rolled across the hills. But the world outside was calling to them, and Ellen knew, however much it pained her, that they needed more than the cramped safety of her kitchen. She remembered the hotline's warning, "Don't imprint, don't let them become house cats, they have to stay wild." It wasn't easy, letting go of control, but she'd learned, slowly, painfully, that healing rarely was, so she set to work building a run. The first morning, she measured the porch in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. The old chicken wire scavenged from the shed was just sturdy enough. She hammered stakes into the damp earth, her hands steady despite the ache in her wrists. When she finished, she filled the run with pine branches, overturned logs, a pile of river stones. It wasn't the wild, but it was as close as she could manage. She carried Rebel and Peanut out at first light. They huddled in her arms, shivering, eyes round as they took in the new world. The sun painted stripes across the mist, dappling their coats. Ellen set them down and stepped back, heart pounding. At first, neither moved. Then slowly, Rebel padded toward a patch of sunlight, his whiskers twitching. Peanut hung back, her small body trembling, until Rebel turned and chirped, beckoning her forward. Ellen sat on the porch steps, breath held. The kittens explored their new kingdom, sniffing at pine cones, pawing at leaves, chasing each other through beams of golden light. Every so often, Rebel would arch his back, feinting at an imaginary foe. Peanut would dart behind a stump, only to creep out moments later, drawn by curiosity. For an hour, Ellen watched, the weight of old sorrows lifting with each tiny triumph. The run became their classroom. Each day, Ellen added something new, a feather tied to a string, a slab of bark teeming with beetles, a box of dirt for digging. She watched them grow bolder, more agile, their movements less awkward, more like the wild things they were meant to be. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at their antics, her laughter echoing off the empty hills, but joy never came without its shadow. One morning, Ellen woke to find Peanut listless and cold, curled in the far corner of the run. The old dread clenched in her chest. She bundled Peanut in a towel, carried her inside, and ran through her mental checklist. Fever, dehydration, infection. She set up the heating pad, coaxed fluids, whispered encouragement. All the while, Rebel paced outside, mewling in protest, confused and lonely. The hours dragged. Ellen's mind flashed back to other nights, holding Jamie in the ER, watching the monitors drop, bargaining with a universe that didn't bargain back. "You're not losing this one," she whispered, brushing Peanut's ears. "Not today." It was a battle of inches. Peanut refused food at first, her breaths coming in shallow pants. Ellen mixed a slurry of formula and mashed meat, dripping it between her lips, willing her to swallow. She sang old lullabies, her voice rough but tender. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, threatening rain. Ellen drew the curtains, focusing only on the rhythm of Peanut's breaths, the rise and fall of her tiny chest. As night crept in, Peanut rallied. Her eyes opened wider, pupils bright in the lamplight. She licked Ellen's finger, weak but determined. Ellen felt hope bloom sharp in her throat, unexpected and terrifying. By dawn, Peanut was strong enough to sit up, mewling softly. Ellen carried her back outside, letting Rebel nuzzle her in greeting. The reunion was clumsy but heartfelt, Rebel's rough tongue licking Peanut's ears as if scolding her for scaring him. In that fragile dawn, Ellen laughed, a bright, clear sound that startled even herself. For a moment, she let herself believe in miracles. She realized then that saving Peanut was more than just a battle against illness. It was a fight against the grief that had threatened to swallow her whole. She saw for the first time that healing could be as slow and surprising as it was painful. Both wildness and gentleness could survive together. Yet the closer she grew to the kittens, the harder it became to imagine letting them go. She caught herself fantasizing about keeping them, about flouting the rules and building a sanctuary all her own. But each day, as she watched them climb higher, run faster, and scan the horizon with hungry, curious eyes, she knew in her bones that love, real love, would mean setting them free. The run became her sanctuary as much as theirs. She drank her morning coffee on the steps, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the kittens tumble and wrestle. She let herself smile, even as she felt the ache of the inevitable goodbye building like thunder far off in the distance. For the first time in years, Ellen allowed herself to live in the in-between, the edge of attachment, the possibility of joy shadowed by loss. And as the sun burned off the last of the morning mist, she realized she could laugh again. She wasn't just saving them, they were saving her too. It started with a glimpse, a fleeting flash of spotted fur in the morning light, a bobcat kitten silhouetted against Ellen's window, tail flicking as it pounced after a dust mote. Ellen didn't see the neighbor's truck idling at the end of her drive, didn't notice the camera phone held up by trembling hands. The world beyond her little sanctuary had begun to wake up, and curiosity always travels faster than caution in a small town. The first sign was subtle. Ellen stopped by the post office to pick up her mail, and the usual chatter dropped off a cliff as she walked in. Mrs. Klein, who'd run the counter since Ellen first moved to Willow Road, forced a too bright smile. "Morning, Ellen. Heard you've been keeping busy out there." The words were innocent enough, but there was something pointed behind them, a ripple of interest and judgment. Ellen forced a tight smile in return, tucking the mail under her arm and retreating quickly to the safety of her car. At the diner, the old-timers gathered by the window nudged each other as Ellen walked by. She heard her name, just a wisp of it, wrapped around words like wild and dangerous. By the time she reached the grocery store, the whispers had mutated into questions. "Is it true, Ellen? You really got wildcats living in your house?" someone called as she reached for a carton of milk. Ellen felt her old anxiety rise, a familiar, choking weight she hadn't missed. It was the same tightness she'd felt in the ER waiting room, knowing people were watching, judging every move she made, every decision, even the ones made in the middle of chaos. The kittens had brought light and laughter back into her home, but now she saw how easily that light could spill into shadow. The rumors found their way online, too. Someone posted a blurry photo of Rebel staring out the kitchen window. The caption, "Bobcat or Big Tabby, you decide." Comments piled up, some worried, others excited, a few angry. Ellen read them late at night, hand trembling on the mouse, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. It didn't take long for the authorities to notice. One afternoon, Ellen came home to find an official-looking envelope wedged in her screen door. "Unlawful possession of wildlife," it read in block letters. Beneath, a warning. Failure to comply could result in fines, confiscation, even prosecution. Her hands shook as she read it. She imagined strangers in uniforms coming for Rebel and Peanut. Imagined the cold emptiness that would follow. She sat at her kitchen table, the kittens asleep in their nest, and stared at the letter. Her mind spun with panic. 100 worst-case scenarios unfolding in a silent, merciless loop. She could call animal control, do the right thing, the safe thing. Or she could hide, lie, try to wait out the storm. Both choices tasted like defeat. But when she looked at Rebel and Peanut, so alive, so impossibly wild and vulnerable, something hardened in her. She wouldn't give up. Not yet. She needed help, someone who understood the gray spaces between rules and rescue. That night, Ellen called Marcia, the local wildlife rehabber whose name she'd scribbled on the back of a receipt weeks ago, but never dared to use. Marcia's voice was warm but brisk, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "You can't keep them forever, Ellen. The law's clear. But you can help them get ready for the next step, if you're willing to do what's needed." Ellen explained everything, the rescue, the sleepless nights, her fears of imprinting. Marcia listened, asked questions, and finally said, "Bring them to me tomorrow morning. I'll show you what comes next. But you need to understand, from now on, every choice is about their wildness. No more coddling. They need to learn how to survive without you." Relief and dread mingled in Ellen's chest as she hung up. She spent the night preparing, gathering supplies, writing notes on the kittens' routines, and whispering apologies to Rebel and Peanut as she explained the changes ahead. She felt like she was betraying them, but Marcia's words echoed in her mind. This was what true guardianship meant, preparing them for a world that wouldn't care how much she loved them. The next morning she loaded the kittens into a carrier, heart in her throat, and drove through the waking town. Main Street felt smaller, meaner, everyone's eyes tracking her passage. At Marcia's house, a tidy ranch with runs and cages in the yard, she was greeted not with suspicion, but with practical kindness. Marcia examined Rebel and Peanut, nodding at their strength, their alertness, their wary independence. "You've done right by them, Ellen. But this is where it gets hard." They walked the property together, discussing next steps, teaching the kittens to hunt, to hide, to fear humans instead of seeking comfort. Ellen would have to be less present, less gentle, more a shadow than a mother. Every interaction from now on had to prepare Rebel and Peanut for the day they would face the world alone. Back at home, Ellen moved through the day in a daze, replaying every moment. When the wildlife officer came by that afternoon, young, polite, but resolute, Ellen met him at the door with her records, her plan, and Marcia's written support. He reviewed everything, warned her again of the consequences if she crossed the line, then left her with a stern promise to check back soon. That night, Ellen watched Rebel and Peanut from the other side of the wire, her fingers aching to reach through and scoop them up. Instead, she sat in the gathering dark, listening to their wild voices echo off the hills, and wondered if they would ever know how much they meant to her. She had become their guardian, but she was learning, painfully, inevitably, that to truly guard something wild, you must be willing to let it go. Ellen woke with the dawn, the house oddly quiet except for the distant chitter of Rebel and Peanut in their enclosure. The confrontation with the wildlife officer lingered in her mind, leaving a residue of anxiety. But there was no room for fear now. If the kittens were to have any chance at freedom, Ellen had to prepare them and herself for the next stage. Outside, the day was bright and crisp, the kind that made the mountain air feel like a promise. Ellen brewed a pot of strong coffee and stepped onto her porch. The run, patched together with chicken wire and hope, seemed smaller each day as Rebel and Peanut grew stronger, their bodies leaner and movements more assured. It was clear they needed more. Space, stimulation, challenge. She remembered Marcia's advice. They need to learn wildness, not comfort. Ellen set out with purpose. She made calls to the local scout troop leader, who'd once helped her clear snow from her drive, and to Marcia, who offered practical tips on building a bigger enclosure. Within days, the project took on a life of its own. Neighborhood kids peered over the fence as Ellen mapped out plans with chalk, the ground soon crisscrossed with lines and notes. At first, the children were wary, their curiosity tinged with the fear that had rippled through the town. But as Ellen explained her mission, helping the bobcats return to the wild, not turning them into pets, their skepticism softened. She organized a workday, and the scout troop arrived in force, armed with hammers, shovels, and boundless energy. They hauled rolls of wire mesh, pounded stakes into the soil, and dragged logs from the creek. Ellen directed with an authority that came from years of leading trauma teams. Her instructions were brisk but encouraging, each child praised for their effort. As they worked, Ellen took the opportunity to teach. She knelt beside a group of wide-eyed children, showing them the sharpness of bobcat claws through a pane of glass, explaining how wild animals must never learn to trust humans too much. "These kittens aren't meant to be pets," she said. "We help them by keeping them wild." The message seemed to land, especially when Rebel, bold as ever, pressed his nose to the wire and gave a challenging chirp that sent the kids into fits of nervous laughter. By mid-afternoon, the new enclosure was finished, twice as large, with high walls, a small shelter, and tree limbs for climbing. Ellen placed logs, rocks, and old bones inside, creating obstacles and hiding places. Marcia arrived with a cooler of frozen mice, demonstrating how to scatter food in ways that encouraged hunting and foraging. Ellen watched, equal parts pride and sorrow tugging at her chest, as Rebel and Peanut explored their new domain, muscles rippling, senses alert. Word of Ellen's efforts spread quickly. Soon, parents began dropping off bags of supplies, blankets, cans of food, toys. Some even left anonymous notes of encouragement, while others brought their children by to see the guardians of Willow Road, the nickname the town kids had given the kittens. Ellen found herself fielding questions, giving impromptu lessons about wildlife and responsibility. The community, which had once watched her with suspicion, now seemed invested in the bobcat's journey. Despite the growing support, state officials remained vigilant. A different wildlife officer stopped by one afternoon, clipboard in hand, inspecting the enclosure and asking pointed questions about imprinting and the kitten's health. Ellen, more confident now, showed her detailed logs, feeding times, health checks, enrichment activities. She explained how the kittens no longer sought her touch, how they flinched from new voices, how Rebel had started hissing at the sight of strangers. The officer nodded, though he warned her, "They can't stay much longer. We'll need proof they're ready for transfer, pictures, videos, maybe even a live demonstration." The words stung, a reminder that time was running short. Ellen felt a pang of loss already forming, but she refused to let it show. She had a job to do, and she would do it well. Determined to meet every requirement, Ellen set up a camera to record the kitten's progress. Each day she reviewed the footage with Marcia, noting improvements in areas that still needed work. They devised new challenges, hiding food beneath rocks, introducing unfamiliar scents, playing recordings of predators. Each task tested the kitten's instincts, and each victory felt like another brick in the foundation of their independence. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, Ellen organized a small goodbye party in her backyard. She invited the scout troop, neighbors, and their families. The kids wore paper bobcat ears, and parents brought homemade cookies. Ellen stood before the crowd, voice shaking but proud, and shared the story of Rebel and Peanut, how they'd come to her on a stormy night, how the community had helped them heal, and how soon they would return to the wild where they belonged. She explained that loving wild things meant letting them go, that true guardianship was about respect, not possession. The children listened, quiet and wide-eyed, as Rebel leaped onto a high log, silhouetted by the last golden light. For a moment, the backyard was utterly still, a collective breath held in awe of what wildness truly meant. That night, after everyone had gone home, Ellen sat in the dark by the enclosure, listening to the soft sounds of the kittens settling down. She realized the town had changed. Maybe she had too. Where there had been suspicion and loneliness, there was now understanding and a kind of pride. She'd built more than a shelter for two bobcat kittens. She'd built a bridge between wild and tame, between solitude and community, between what was and what might be. The journey wasn't over, but Ellen understood now. She wasn't facing it alone. The storm hit with little warning, sweeping down from the mountains in a wave of hail and icy wind that rattled windows and shook branches loose from the old pine trees. Ellen pressed her face to the glass, watching sheets of rain blur the world outside, anxiety creeping in as lightning split the sky. The kittens huddled together in their enclosure, ears flattened, eyes wide. She kept an ear out for their cries, but even Rebel's usual bravado was muted tonight. When the storm finally passed, the air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and crushed pine needles. Ellen donned her coat and hurried outside to check on Rebel and Peanut. The enclosure was battered, the ground pocked with hailstones, but the kittens seemed unharmed, nervous but whole. She breathed a sigh of relief and set about cleaning up, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she gathered fallen branches and reinforced the weak points in the wire. It wasn't until the next morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the yard, that Ellen noticed something wrong. Rebel was gone. Panic shot through her, wild and electric. She scanned the enclosure, calling his name softly even though she knew he wouldn't answer. The wire along the back fence was twisted, a hole torn just large enough for a desperate bobcat to squeeze through. Heart-pounding, Ellen ran into the house, grabbed her boots and a flashlight, and dashed out into the fields beyond her backyard. She called Marcia, breathless, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's gone! Rebel's out! Please, I need help!" Within the hour, Marcia arrived, bringing with her a neighbor named Joel and a handful of local kids who'd helped build the enclosure. The group fanned out, combing the fields and the woods, eyes scanning for any sign of the missing kitten. Ellen's years as a nurse kept her focused on the practical. Look for tracks, check under porches, call his name quietly, but inside her mind whirled with fear. She pictured Rebel hurt, lost, chased by dogs or hit by a car, his brief wild life snuffed out by the world's indifference. It was Joel who found the first clue. A patch of flattened grass near the creek, a few drops of blood on a stone. The group grew quiet, the children's excitement fading into worry. Ellen forced herself not to panic. He's strong, she told herself. He survived worse, but her hands shook as she followed the trail, each step a battle against the memories of loss that haunted her darkest nights. They found Rebel at the edge of town, huddled beneath a sagging fence near an abandoned shed. A stray dog, half wild, ribs showing through matted fur, sniffed at the ground nearby, ears pricked. Ellen's heart lurched. Marcia motioned for the group to hang back as she approached the dog, voice gentle but firm. Joel tossed a handful of jerky into the grass, drawing the dog away, and Ellen crept closer to Rebel. He was hurt. Blood matted his side, one hind leg twisted at an odd angle. His eyes were wild, fear and pain sharpening the blue into shards of ice. Ellen dropped to her knees, whispering his name, hands trembling. For a moment Rebel shrank back, unsure, but then he recognized her scent and allowed himself to be scooped into her arms. The trip home was a blur. Ellen moved with the calm of someone who'd spent a lifetime in crisis, barking instructions to Joel and Marcia, clearing a space on her kitchen table, gathering her old nursing kit. Marcia held Rebel as Ellen cleaned the wounds, her fingers gentle but unflinching. The others watched, faces pale and silent, as Ellen splinted the leg, cleaned the gash, and wrapped the kitten in towels. Peanut hovered nearby, crying softly, her world shaken. Ellen stroked her ears, whispering reassurance. He's going to be okay. He's a fighter, just like you. But the setback rattled the community. Word spread quickly. Some praised Ellen for her quick action. Others questioned the wisdom of keeping wild animals so close to town. The debate was sharpest online, where anonymous voices stoked fear and anger. Ellen found herself defending her choices again, posting updates and photos to reassure worried parents and wildlife officials. The scrutiny was exhausting, the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her like the storm. Wildlife authorities showed up the next day. 2 officers, one familiar, the other new. They inspected Rebel, reviewed Ellen's records, and debated in hushed tones with Marcia on the porch. Ellen's heart twisted as she listened from the kitchen, knowing how thin the line was between rescue and removal. In the end, it was Marcia's testimony that saved the day. She spoke of Ellen's dedication, the kitten's progress, the extraordinary efforts to prepare them for release. "They're wild, not pets," Marcia said firmly. "They're almost ready. Don't take them away now, not when they're so close." After a tense silence, the officers relented. They gave Ellen strict instructions: document everything, limit human contact, prove that the kittens were resilient and not dependent on her. The relief was so intense it made Ellen dizzy, her knees weak as she thanked Marcia and the officers, promising to do whatever was necessary. That night, Ellen sat with Rebel and Peanut, her heart raw with gratitude and fear. Rebel's wounds were healing, but it was clear to everyone, especially the sanctuary staff watching the videos, that the kittens had been tested in ways no one expected. Their survival in the face of danger convinced even the skeptics that they were ready for transfer. Ellen lay awake, listening to their breathing, wondering what tomorrow would bring. She had risked so much, her reputation, her peace, her heart. But looking at the 2 kittens curled together, wild and alive, she knew she wouldn't have done anything differently. The storm had changed everything, but in the wreckage, she'd found a purpose that made the pain worthwhile. Tomorrow would be another test, but for tonight they were safe, and that was enough. The air was sharp with the scent of morning as Ellen loaded Rebel and Peanut into the crate, her hands moving on instinct even as her mind resisted what came next. For days after Rebel's escape and recovery, she had documented every step, filming their hunts, recording their cautious avoidance of her, noting how their muscles coiled and released like small springs as they scaled branches or pounced on hidden prey. With Marcia's help, Ellen compiled a record so thorough that even the state officials nodded with grudging approval. Still, none of that made this day easier. Ellen's old Subaru rattled down the highway toward Denver, the kittens quiet in the back, Marcia riding shotgun. Through the window, the Colorado landscape opened wide, pine forests giving way to rolling fields, the world stretching out, full of promise and heartbreak. They drove in silence for a long time, both women lost in thought, the only sound the rush of tires on blacktop and the soft, muffled thumps of the kittens moving in their crate. The Wildlife Education Center was perched on the edge of the city, a sprawling facility surrounded by fields and fencing, where wild creatures could heal, learn, and if they were lucky, find their way home again. The place pulsed with energy, kids in neon vests guided by volunteers, teachers snapping photos, visitors pointing in awe at rescued hawks and foxes sunning themselves in wide, natural enclosures. Ellen's heart pounded as she signed the intake paperwork, her name shaky on the dotted line. Marcia squeezed her shoulder, whispering, "You did good, Ellen. They're ready for this." Ellen wanted to believe it, wanted to let pride outweigh grief, but every fiber of her being screamed to turn back, to load the kittens into her car and drive forever, away from goodbyes and endings. But this was the promise she'd made, not just to Marcia and the state, but to Rebel and Peanut themselves. They deserved wildness, not walls. Love, she realized, meant honoring their wildness, even if it broke her heart. Staff gathered to help with the transfer, quietly respectful of the weight of the moment. Ellen and Marcia followed as the crate was carried to the largest enclosure, an open sun-dappled field dotted with trees and boulders, tall grasses waving in the breeze. A small crowd had gathered, volunteers, staff, and a handful of local families who had followed the kitten's story through Ellen's updates. Ellen even spotted a few familiar faces, neighbors, the scout troop, kids in homemade bobcat masks. A hush fell as the crate was placed at the edge of the field. Ellen crouched beside it, her fingers trembling as she slid the door open. For a moment, Rebel and Peanut hesitated, blinking at the light, their wild eyes searching for threats and possibilities. Rebel was the first to step out, his movements tentative at first, then growing bold as he tested the grass beneath his paws. Peanut followed, smaller and shyer, pressing close to Rebel as they explored this new, unfamiliar freedom. Ellen stayed perfectly still, resisting every instinct to call out, to coax them back, to offer comfort one last time. She had promised herself and the kittens that she would honor their journey, that she would let them find their own way. As the kittens ventured farther, the crowd watched in awed silence. Marcia stood at Ellen's side, her presence a steady anchor. "You gave them everything they needed," she murmured. "That's more than most get." Ellen nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She felt hollowed out and filled up at the same time, grief and pride wrestling for space in her chest. The center's director approached, asking if Ellen would be willing to share her story with visitors. At first, Ellen hesitated. She wasn't used to the spotlight, didn't relish the thought of reliving every pain and triumph. But then she saw a small group of children gathered nearby, eyes wide and hopeful, and something in her softened. She agreed, her voice trembling but sure as she recounted the stormy nights she found the kittens, the sleepless weeks, the help she'd received from her neighbors and the community, the setbacks and the hope that grew stronger every day. "It's never easy letting go," she said, voice catching. "But loving something wild means trusting it to find its own way. Sometimes the best thing you can do, the bravest thing, is to say goodbye." After the talk, Ellen wandered back to the edge of the enclosure. Rebel and Peanut were already exploring, their bodies low to the ground as they stalked grasshoppers, their tails flicking in perfect instinctive harmony. Ellen's heart ached, but she knew she had done right by them. She didn't know if they'd remember her, if they'd ever understand what she'd given up. But she saw the future in their strong, wild bodies, in the way they bounded through the grass without a backward glance. The center's staff promised updates, photos, and news of the kitten's progress, but Ellen understood that this was, truly, the end of their journey together. Her home would be empty when she returned. The quiet would feel deeper, the shadows a little longer. Still, as she watched Rebel and Peanut disappear into the tall grass, Ellen felt something shift inside her. Pride, yes, but also peace. She had kept her promise. She had been their guardian, their nurse, their reluctant mother. Now she had become their witness. On the drive home, the world looked different. The roads were the same, the mountains familiar, but Ellen carried something new. The knowledge that her love, her risk, her willingness to let go had given two wild hearts a real chance at freedom, and perhaps a chance for herself as well. Ellen's house felt impossibly quiet. The soft scrape of her shoes on the hardwood, the tick of the old clock in the hallway, even the sound of her own breathing seemed magnified in the hush that filled every corner. The kittens were gone, and in their absence Ellen was left with an unexpected abundance of time, memory, and emotion. It felt at first like grief. She missed the squeak of the crate at dawn, the scrambling paws behind the kitchen chair, the faint, wild scent that lingered on her old flannel blankets. At first, Ellen moved through her days as if underwater. She tidied the kitchen, washed the basket and towels, put away the old first aid kit and the stack of notes she'd scribbled during the crisis. The enclosure outside stood empty, pine needles gathering at the corners, a few stray tufts of bobcat fur clinging to the wire. More than once she caught herself pausing at the window, half expecting to see Rebel's spotted back slip through the grass or Peanut's small shape curled in the sun. Each time, her heart squeezed with a mixture of longing and quiet pride. On the kitchen table, Ellen arranged a modest shrine, 2 tiny paw prints pressed into clay, a faded photo of Rebel stalking a pine cone, a thank you card signed by the scout troop. There was a new letter, too, from the Wildlife Center, updating her on the kitten's progress. Rebel and Peanut were adapting well, learning to hunt in the larger enclosure, beginning to interact with other wild bobcats. The words were a balm, and Ellen read them over and over, the lines committing themselves to memory. With the house so silent, Ellen turned once more to her journal. The pages filled quickly, her handwriting steadier than it had been in years. She wrote about the kittens, their courage and curiosity, their stubbornness and fragility. She wrote about the storm that brought them, and the storms that had shaped her own life. The loss of Jamie, the slow erosion of her marriage after Tom's death, the gradual narrowing of her world until, somehow, 2 wild bobcats shattered the walls she'd so carefully built. The process was not easy. Some days the loneliness returned in waves, sharp and cold, threatening to undo all she had gained. On those days, Ellen forced herself to walk the property, to breathe the high mountain air, to notice the world as it was now, a little emptier, yes, but also full of possibility. She stopped at the enclosure, sometimes sitting in the grass for hours, listening to the wind and the distant call of a hawk. It was in this solitude that Ellen began to see the true lesson the kittens had left behind. She realized slowly that the act of rescue had been mutual. She had saved them from the storm, from hunger, from the dangers of a world indifferent to their vulnerability. But they had saved her too. From bitterness, from the inertia of old grief, from the shrinking of her own heart. In caring for Rebel and Peanut, Ellen had rediscovered a part of herself she thought had died with Jamie. The part that could risk love, that could hope, that could open itself to the world despite all its dangers. She wrote, "True rescue is never one way. Every act of care, every risk is a kind of leap of faith. It demands trust, not in safety, but in the wildness of life, in the possibility that something good can grow from heartbreak." One evening, as the sun slid behind the mountains, Ellen invited a few neighbors and the scout troop over for dinner. They ate on the porch, sharing stories and laughter, the sense of community stronger than ever. Someone asked her what she missed most about the kittens. Ellen smiled, her answer honest and unvarnished. "I miss their wildness, not just their company, but the way they reminded me that life is about letting go, about loving enough to set someone free." After dinner, she found herself deep in conversation with a young mother whose son had been one of the guardians of Willow Road. The woman confessed that she too had struggled with letting go, her husband gone, her son growing up too fast. Ellen listened, understanding in a way she never would have before. "We think we're protecting them," she said softly. "But sometimes the greatest love is trust. Trust in them. Trust in the world. Trust that even if we can't control what happens, we can give them the strength to face it." The words lingered in the cool night air. When the guests had gone, Ellen sat on her porch steps watching fireflies blink in the dark. She felt the ache of missing Rebel and Peanut, but it was different now. Not just pain, but gratitude. She realized she wasn't as alone as she thought. Her neighbors, the children, even the wild creatures in the fields were all part of a larger story, a web of connection and risk and renewal. In the pages of her journal, Ellen wrote her final lesson. To really love is to set free, not to cling from fear, but to trust in the wildness of the world and our own hearts. Letting go isn't a failure. It's the bravest thing we can do. As she closed the journal, Ellen felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The kittens had gone, but their legacy remained, rippling out into her life, her town, and beyond. In learning to let go, Ellen had finally come home to herself. Family Day at the Wildlife Center dawned bright and clear, the Colorado sky an endless canvas of blue. Ellen pulled into the gravel lot, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She had been invited as a volunteer, But more than that, she was returning as someone whose story had rippled far beyond her own quiet home. As she stepped out of her car, she noticed crowds gathering, children chattering, and parents scanning the open fields with hopeful eyes. The place buzzed with possibility, alive with energy and learning. Ellen made her way through the familiar gates, her steps slowing as she caught sight of Rebel and Peanut in their new world. The Bobcats had grown, sleek, powerful, their movements confident and unrestrained. They were the stars of the center today, drawing a ring of awed children and adults. Rebel leapt atop a fallen log, muscles bunching beneath his coat as Peanut prowled the tall grass, tail twitching with intent curiosity. For a moment, Ellen simply watched, overwhelmed by pride and a gentle ache. These were the same kittens she'd found shaking in a storm, and now they were teaching the next generation what it meant to be wild and free. A staff member greeted her, a volunteer badge pressed into her palm. "Glad you made it, Ellen. We have a group of school kids eager to hear about your journey with the Bobcats. They know all about you from our newsletter." Ellen smiled, nerves humming, but there was a steadiness inside her that hadn't existed before. She followed the staffer to a shaded area where benches circled beneath the pines. Dozens of children, some wearing paper bobcat masks, looked up as she took her seat. When Ellen began to speak, her voice was quiet at first, but as she shared the story of a stormy night, 2 frightened kittens, and the winding road from rescue to release, she felt the words flow easily. She told them how hard it had been to let go, how she'd feared making mistakes, and how her neighbors and Marcia had given her the courage to do what was right. She talked about wildness, not just in bobcats, but in people too. "We all have something wild inside us," she told the kids. "It's what helps us survive, and sometimes it's what lets us heal." A little girl in the front row raised her hand. "Did they forget you?" Ellen thought for a moment, glancing at Rebel and Peanut as they tumbled together in the sun. "Maybe," she admitted, "but that's how it's supposed to be. They're living the lives they were meant for." "That's the best thank you I could ever get." Later, Ellen watched as families toured the enclosures, learning about all the animals, the foxes, hawks, owls, and of course the bobcats. She found herself answering questions, sharing advice, even calming one boy who worried aloud that Peanut might be lonely. "She has Rebel and the whole wild world," Ellen assured him, "and she has you cheering her on." She saw the ripple of her journey in the faces around her. Parents seemed less anxious, children more curious than afraid. Some neighbors from Willow Road greeted her warmly, their former suspicion transformed into respect. A few scout troop members presented Ellen with a homemade Guardian's badge, a small but treasured token of their connection. Throughout the day, the Wildlife Center emphasized the importance of guardianship, not just for animals, but for each other. Ellen listened as staff shared stories about injured deer nursed back to health, eagles released to the sky, and other rescues where love meant letting go. Again and again, she heard the message: real guardianship is preparing others for freedom, not possession. It's giving them what they need to thrive, even if it means saying goodbye. During a break, the center's director asked Ellen if she would help with future outreach events, talks at schools, community groups, maybe even writing a piece for their website. Ellen hesitated only a moment. The thought of sharing her story with more people, of spreading the lessons learned from Rebel and Peanut, filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. "I'd love to," she said, the answer clear and certain. In the afternoon, as the crowd began to thin and the light softened, Ellen took a quiet walk along the edge of the fields. She found Rebel and Peanut watching her from a distance, their eyes bright, bodies poised in the tall grass. They didn't run to her, didn't need her anymore. But for just a heartbeat, Ellen felt their presence, their gratitude, and something even bigger, the legacy they'd begun. She realized that her own life had changed, not just in the busy weeks of rescue, but in the weeks and months after. She was part of a new story now, woven into a tapestry of people and creatures bound together by hope, courage, and the willingness to risk love. The house back on Willow Road was still quiet, but no longer lonely. There were visitors now, neighbors who dropped by, scout troop kids eager to help with new projects, the occasional lost dog or hungry raccoon she guided back to safety. Ellen understood that the cycle would continue. Another storm would come, Another wild creature would need a hand, and another human heart would be changed in the giving. She was ready for it. She saw herself not as the end of the story, but as part of something bigger, a chain of guardianship and trust that reached far beyond her own loss and loneliness. As the sun dipped low and the mountains cast long shadows across the fields, Ellen felt a profound peace. She had learned that the love that transforms us is the love that trusts, risks, and releases. It's the legacy that lives on in every wild creature set free, in every heart made whole by caring, and in every story told around kitchen tables and campfires. Before she left, Ellen joined the staff for one last announcement to the crowd. If you've been touched by wildness, compassion, or second chances, support wildlife education and follow our channel for more real stories of healing and hope. As she drove home, the light fading behind her, Ellen Parker felt not empty but full of gratitude, memory, and a new sense of belonging. The guardians of Willow Road had found their place in the world, and so had she.